Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
I wanted to talk with you, Nathan, about Christian nationalism today, because I think the term we're just seeing it so often, and it's one of those...
It's becoming unavoidable.
It's become unavoidable, I think. And it's one of those terms, so I'm of the mind, Nathan, that if something is inevitable, especially a term, you just can't get away from it. It makes sense. You have to make your peace with it and try to provide some clarity as an act of service, especially if you're a public communicator or something like that. This has happened with other words as well. We did a series on woke and wokeism. Mm-hmm. That is a word. Clearly, it is not going anywhere. You can say, well, it's not a helpful word, and in an ideal world, nobody would use it. We don't live in an ideal world, and people are going to continue using it. This is why we talked about it. I think something happened a little bit along those lines with evangelicalism. Well, should we just retire the word? Well, the word's probably not going anywhere. And so we need to talk about that. And here, Christian nationalism as a phrase is not going anywhere anytime soon. And the conversation surrounding it, I think, is only going to ramp up, especially as we push toward election season here.
Well, so and I think
this is going to be I
think we can go beyond that, though, because
series, yeah.
So I would say this election is part of that, but I would say that there's a broader trend that's beyond any specific candidates or specific elections, just in general happening. And I don't think it's even just an American version. I think there might be a tinge of a global aspect to this as well. So certainly our context is part of it, but a rethinking on what this means globally, I think, is in the works in the future as well. So maybe we'll get into some of that.
Yeah, and so just to let you know what you're in for here, this is a two-part series. Part one, we're going to focus on, maybe you could think about it as some of the better aspects that are contained in a phrase like Christian nationalism, and a recent string of intellectuals who have come to deeply appreciate, most of them from atheist backgrounds, who have come to deeply appreciate Christian values for civilization and also the social order that we have taken for granted in the West. So we'll talk about some of those people in this episode, and in the second episode, we will talk about the negative aspects of Christian nationalism and some of the people who we think are moving in a direction that's misguided and dangerous. So we hope that sounds interesting to you and that you'll stick with us as we talk about this. But for this episode, Nathan, I'm just curious, when you hear a phrase like Christian nationalism, where does your mind go initially?
Well, so I think, up until recently, it's always been in a negative sense where people have used it as a slur or a scary thing of, the Christian nationalists, sort of the sense of like, the militias are forming to come out and take away everybody's rights. That's probably more the way in which it's being used. I think that's because of the nationalism part of that phrase, not because of the Christian part necessarily. So I'm hearing it mainly on a media and a news level as a negative, but then, as you're saying, on the academic side, there are those who aren't using the phrase but are stepping into some of it in an appreciative sense. So we have to acknowledge that the I would say the popular level connotation of it is a negative concept, although some people are now kind of leaning into adopting it and be like, yeah, that is what I am. I think we'll get to that side of it more in the second part of the series. But I would just want to put that out there, is that I think the way that the majority of the people in America are using it is negative right now.
All right. I want to move us toward some tentative definitions here in a second, but let me start on this note and see if this will push us in that direction. So I think a monumental book of recent years is Tom Holland's book, Dominion. And I know some of our listeners will have read that book. It's a breathtaking work of history. And I think gradually people are starting to recognize it's a real masterpiece. You can, and it's a big book. It's a doorstop, but essentially, the circumstances of how that came about are really interesting. So Tom Holland, he's written fiction as well. He's a sort of a little bit of a Renaissance man, but he had written a book on Islam before that. And, and he wrote the book, and, it was, again, by all accounts, a very good book. But he had some of his harshest critics were Muslims. And they said, you're just assuming, not arguing, you're just assuming that all of the supernatural aspects of our faith are mythical. You never make an argument for it. What would happen if you called into question all of your assumptions? Maybe think about that. Well, Tom Holland actually took that criticism to heart, which is kind of a rare thing these days, isn't it? There's a good word of, just a plug for intellectual humility for all of us. So he changed it. So he began to think about his own values, and they were all what he took to be the values of liberalism and Enlightenment values. And he had always taken for granted, if somebody moves out of a phase of ignorance, so religion or whatever, and divests themselves of those influences, breaks off the shackles of religion. This is a familiar story. You might say this is a modern myth. Right. Yeah. Deconstructs, gets rid of all of that, throws off the shackles of religion. Then we all come to that rationalistic outlook. That's what you mature into that. So he began to doubt that. And so he dug into it, and he discovered, oh no, that is not true. We do not mature into Enlightenment rationalism. What I thought was what happened. I mean, I thought what happened to us was we came through religion, and then we came to that conclusion. But he did the research. He wrote Dominion, and he determined that the wellspring of those values was actually Christianity. And so his argument, and so much to the chagrin and annoyance and rage of a lot of public atheist intellectuals, A.C. Grayling being one of them, who he actually did a few back and forths with him. But he basically he makes statements like, we're all Christian. A.C. Grayling is pretty thoroughly Christian. Now, he's using Christian in a very broad sense. He doesn't mean that A.C. Grayling reads the Bible, prays, and goes to church. He means that his value structure, most of his beliefs about how it is to be a humane person and to treat others are thoroughly shaped by Christianity. So you don't know where, in essence, most of us don't know where the gospel ends and we begin, even if we've forgotten that. And so
Holland,
his argument is kind of, we're all
Holland is not a Christian.
Yeah.
Holland is not a professing Christian.
Yes. He's not a professing Christian yet. He seems to be a little bit more, he seems to be inching his way towards such a conclusion. He's kind of, you might say he's in the sort of Jordan Peterson camp a little bit.
Okay.
And he's another guy we're going to bring up here in a second. But I think that gives us so he is a person who recognizes Christianity as unbelievably valuable for social order, for a flourishing civilization. And he's also a person who would say, if you take it away, if you rip out that heritage, there will literally be hell to pay.
So John Gray fits in here with Straw Dogs. Do you think? Is there a parallel there to John Gray?
The parallel with John Gray these days is, yeah.
Well, I'm just saying John Gray, it seems like, has made that argument as an atheist that he's saying what modern kind of intellectual atheism is espousing is actually just Christian virtue repackaged in atheistic moral language, but it borrows heavily from Christianity while trying to refute Christianity, if I'm remembering the argument correctly there.
Yes. Yeah. No, and he basically, so he's basically atheism, or, humanism is just, as you said, a repackaged version of Christianity, complete with its own eschatology. John Gray, though, as is typical of a deep thinker, has continued to develop his thought, and he's Mr. Bleak. So his latest book is all about how how liberalism is over, and he's basically if you just pay attention to, this is a whole different discussion, but if you just pay attention to politics right now in history, the vision that you're going to get is a pretty alarming one. So his latest book just charts the dismantling of the liberal order. And again, that's what Tom Holland and some of these others, Jordan Peterson, are decrying. They're saying we are in the process of ripping up this heritage. And if we do that, the social order as we now know it and understand it will be over, and it will be replaced by something else, something very different. What it exactly is, we don't know. But we can look around the world and we can see some examples that aren't very encouraging. So we can talk, but yeah, so John Gray is another one who's, you think of him as the shadow side.
Well, but there was a Dawkins quote, I mean, several years ago where he sort of was espousing this uneasy idea. He's saying, by destroying Christianity, we didn't stop to think about what might replace it. So, you know,
yeah.
I wouldn't say he's like a big rah-rah in the Christian camp there, but would fit into that realm of recognizing that there's a stabilizing feature to Christian thought for society. Let me throw an old reference in here. Blaise Pascal. So lots of people are familiar with Pascal's wager, and I think use it incorrectly. So in Pascal's wager, the way that we kind of, in a modern flippant reductionistic way, look at it is say, look, there are two options. There's a God or there's a not, or there's not. If I believe that there's a God, that's a better bet, because if it turns out that I'm wrong, the consequences of that are far worse than if I don't believe that there's a God and it turns out that it's true. So by believing which premise has the worst consequences if it turns out that I'm wrong when I adopt it. Now, I would say that's not how biblical faith works at all. In my understanding, and it's been a long time since I've read the wager, so correct me if I'm wrong here, Cameron, is that Pascal's actual argument is if you live your life as if there's a God, and it turns out that there isn't, that you will still have led a good, virtuous, and productive life that's for the betterment and the good of humanity, even if that's all there is to it. It seemed to me like his argument was that if by following the teachings of Christ and it turns out that they're not true, you still will have led a better life than if you've just followed your own self-interest and it turns out that wasn't true. It might seem like a rabbit trail here, but I think it's parallel in the sense that he's assuming that living as if there is a God produces more value to the culture around you in a way that is good, even if it turns out that the premise that is based upon turns out to be false. At the end of your life, it was still worth it, so to speak, for the betterment of everybody else. Am I reading something or remembering that incorrectly? Do you know off the top of your head if that seems right?
No, that's right. That's definitely an aspect of it. It's a lot of people who look at it and say, well, this is a fire insurance policy argument for the existence of God. You have to go back to what he was actually doing. And it's a huge part of the the pensées is his assertion that you're dealing with distractions and indifference. So distractions and apathy were the key obstacles to the gospel, he was arguing. And I mean, my goodness, think about where we're at now. That's true even more so today.
This is the 1700s.
Right. So, and one of those major distractions in Pascal's day was gambling. And so this was his clever way of subverting that distraction and using it as a way to point to the existence of God. But it's actually a way more subtle argument, as you pointed out, Nathan. And one aspect is, it's not just fire insurance, but if you live in the light of the gospel, even if you're not sure it's true, it will make you such a beautiful ingredient in your society. It will be to the benefit of everyone around you, including yourself. So you will flourish, so this is one of those we've talked before, Nathan, about. So you're right to bring it up here. It is a very apt example because we've talked about the shift in the demand or the nature of evidence that people want these days, from evidential to existential. So what kind of a person are you? Who are you? And with Christianity, all right, is it good for society? Is it bad? And you have a whole group of people now who I think are the tip of the iceberg, Nathan. I think you're going to see a lot more people converting along these lines who basically, for them, a powerful apologetic argument is Christianity is good for society.
All right, go there,
and
Cameron.
Christianity promotes human flourishing. Mm-hmm.
All right.
So let's. And I know this makes
Hassan
this is going to make some of us uncomfortable.
Here we go. Yep. All right. Let's do it.
Yeah, sure. So the best one to point to right here is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, of course, author of Infidel and then I think most recently Prey, Prey. She's kind of a little bit of an intellectual hero for me. She's a totally fearless she might not be fearless, but she's very courageous and brave, and so much so that she has to travel around with a bodyguard.
Life goals for Cameron.
That's right. So she recently became a Christian, announced her conversion. So a lot of people, again, she was also loosely numbered at one point with the New Atheists. So this is a very big deal. She wrote an article on it in Unheard magazine. We talked about this in a past episode. Mm-hmm. But she's an incredibly honest person, and so I've watched several interviews with her where she talks about this in very candid terms. And so when people ask her, so did you just convert because of political expediency? Was this just pragmatism that played a part in your conversion? And she's very honest. She says, it did play a part in my conversion. Yes, I think Christianity is good for society and culture, and we would distance ourselves from it to our detriment. She also says things like, and Nathan, you're just going to love this, it works for me right now. And so, and she really just sees as tentative as that. Now, remember, she's a young convert. So, I mean, and she would say, I'm learning, I'm growing, but she goes that right now this works for me. She also admits, and this is the other big personal piece, and she's expounded on it. I went through an existential crisis. I felt empty and lonely, and I didn't feel any sense of meaning in my life. And I was, in this one interview, she talked about she'd become an alcoholic. She was drinking a copious amount to try to, and here's another interesting thing. This really pushes against the grain of our age. I was seeing the best therapists, spending tons of money on it, and it didn't work. I think we should just let that sink in for a second. Therapy wasn't scratching the itch. That's our culture's answer to. That's our culture's equivalent of a spiritual answer. All right, when you've exhausted medicine, this is the equivalent of calling an exorcist almost. Now it's time for a therapist. You've reached the end of the line. This person will then, you pay this person to talk to you, and this had better work. And she finally came to a therapist who said, now again, Nathan, my prediction is you're going to hate this. Her one therapist who did help her a little bit by pointing her beyond therapy, but basically said, describe and imagine your ideal God. And so she did, and that ideal God turned out to be a pretty close portrait of Jesus. Now, this makes me uncomfortable too, because I'm firing through my head is, Sigmund Freud and Feuerbach saying, aha, see, there's projection right there, wish fulfillment, granddaddy in the sky.
Okay, but
anyway, I've said enough to, yeah.
But so, because the counter argument to that is that no, what you're watching is the proper application of the argument from desire. So you go back to C.S. Lewis. I mean, Alistair McGrath, I think, is kind of the popular standard bearer of this argument of saying, I get thirsty, I long for water, and it turns out that actually there is water that satiates that thirst that I have.
Yep.
And so the things that we find ourselves that are embedded within the nature of what it means to be human, that we find a craving for, actually do have something real. Now, this is a design thing of saying you're created with certain desires that are made to be fulfilled in certain ways, but that the craving and the desire for how would you conceive the ideal God to be is, on one hand, ridiculous, because that's basically what everybody's trying to do, is make God in their own image. I see that. On the other side, it would make sense that if there really was a God who wanted us to know him and be made in a way that we would reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from every one of us, to quote the New Testament on this, that there would be components and elements of that would, I'm trying to walk through here this line of like, I think Christianity does really
Yeah.
work well
Well,
pragmatically because it's true, but I don't think that it's
yes.
true because it's pragmatic.
Right. And so I think one way to do this is to look at the C.S. Lewis provocative thought about desire, which was not a formal argument, and formalize it a little bit, like you were, and like Alistair McGrath does. Peter Crave takes it and basically, so the thought experiment, and it's not an argument, it's just a provocative statement from the hope section of Christianity, of Mere Christianity, where Lewis, and I won't get the quote precisely right, but yeah, you're thirsty, there is such a thing as water. You're hungry, there is such a thing as food. You desire companionship, there is such a thing as friendship, those kinds of things. So if you say for every natural and innate desire, there is a corresponding object, then you can get somewhere, and this can be a powerful clue. So people say, I want to fly, like Superman, or I want a Corvette. Well, those are not natural, innate desires. The natural and innate desires are the things that you actually need: food, water, sleep, rest, companionship, intimacy, those kinds of things. And so if all of us, and the controversial claim now is that if we all have if we have eternity in our hearts, to use the language of Ecclesiastes, the only object, this object's a weird word here, that could satisfy such a longing would be the infinite God himself, your maker. And that's what seems to be happening here. So in that sense, there's a fit between the longings of your soul and your maker. And you try to satisfy those anywhere else, you will encounter frustration and ultimately despair. And that's precisely what Ali was saying. But the other interesting aspect here is, so we're pushing toward a little bit of a definition here of Christian nationalism in the best sense, which would be the recognition that Christian values are the wellspring of Western civilization. And in that sense, you want a nation shaped by Christian values, not in a coercive sense. All the people we're naming, so Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, all of these people recognize the value of Christianity precisely for the value it's placed on human life and the, basically, in a word, virtue that it is given to us. And so the notion that this would be somehow carried out through the sword, so to speak, there is a religion that does that, and it's called Islam. And Hirsi Ali, of course, that's her background, and she speaks very eloquently about the ongoing threat of Islam. And she makes a difference, she distinguishes between Islam and Muslims, because there are many Muslims who are not necessarily pushing explicitly toward a universal caliphate or a theocracy, but Islam, that is written into the very fabric of what it is. It's a conquest religion. Christianity is not, but it's
tried to be before in the past.
We'll talk more about this.
So we have
that has not prevented people from abusing it in such a direction.
But I think that past is an important thing of what we have to be careful about when we get into part 2 of this conversation about what the future of it is. So there are things that we've tried before.
Absolutely not
so we'll
shrink
bring
from
that
it.
back in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. No, I mean, and that's why that's part of the value of history is we want to pay attention. We've been here before, so to speak. But no, in its best instantiation and its authentic one, Christianity is about the Christian political vision is one of, it revolves around the cultivation of virtue, really, and everything else follows. Now that sounds too simple a formula, but that's where we're kind of, Let's hear from you, Nathan.
So I was going to say, can we take a minute here and speak to what some of those Christian ideals would be that are good for a culture? So first ones that pop into mind would be you see modeled in the life of Jesus, him spending a lot of time outside of the centers of power in the small little towns, healing, touching, eating with the nobodies of the time. So this intimate emphasis and focus on the least of these. I mean, that's a phrase that he routinely uses as a place of focus for Those who have means and power and
And
privilege,
that's
where do they focus
massive.
on the least of these?
Mm-hmm.
So the value of the
Yep.
individual, let the little children come to me. So the
Mm-hmm.
affirmation of people who aren't able to produce widgets in your economy, the
Mm-hmm.
lame, the blind, that whole realm of who is valuable, who does God want us to look at and identify with. And then also, when you can take it even farther than that to say that these people just weren't interesting to Jesus, that he was willing to sacrifice and die for them. Um, that fundamental concept of the value of the individual, regardless of any other category, is pretty stellar. And so that translates into then a concept that was very heavily embedded in earlier times in the concept of God-given rights, that there was a creator, that we were his creation. Old Testament language was like, we
Mm-hmm.
are the sheep of his pasture, sort of thing. It is not we who, it is he who made us and not we ourselves. I mean, think about that as a sentence for foundationally thinking about the core of what it means to be human. Um, so you have this idea
Mm-hmm.
that there's a God, it's not us, that we are given rights, that we have an intrinsic value as a human before a divine being. Also, that ultimately, justice and righteousness are not socially constructed concepts, but have an ontological reality
Mm-hmm.
embedded in something outside of the will of humanity. And then that value piece, those are all basically necessary for any concept of any formation of any types of rights language, any type of democratic process where you would say that the will of everybody is invaluable, and for free speech where you would say everybody should be able to say what they're thinking, that there would be a freedom of conscience and then a collaboration rather than coercion to arrive at definitive goals and outworkings for um, relationships, families, communities, and countries. All of those are pretty deeply baked into that idea. And then when you go beyond that and
Mm-hmm.
then pull that divine thread out or foundation out of that, the concept of human rights doesn't even make sense anymore when you really start pushing into it. So, what are some of the ones that I missed there? I would say that the other way that you can look at this, Cameron,
Well,
is if you look
I mean,
at um, visualize. One other thing, real quick, while you're thinking of your list, is to visualize what are the liberal representative democracies or republics in the world. All of them are post-Christian, meaning that you have to have these Christian
mm-hmm.
ideas captivate the heart and mind of the population before they can set up the structure that now is running on the leftover fumes of what it previously was. You don't get a liberal England or France without it being Christian first. And so that's worth, like, on one hand, you can make this a theological thing. On the other, you can just make it a practical historical look at what has happened in the past.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you can't pay enough attention to the fact that Christianity, I mean, that least of these aspects. So that's part of what drew Tom Holland. Well, initially it turned him off. So he talks about initially as a child he had a huge infatuation with dinosaurs and just these massive, powerful, prehistoric creatures that roamed the earth. But then, as he began to study history and ancient history, he became fascinated by, as he calls it, another kind of dinosaur, pagan generals and pagan heroes and these kinds of, Roman generals, people like that. And he found Jesus very off-putting. As he said, he goes, I just thought Jesus was, he was kind of a loser at first. That's just, and so he would look, but then he goes, the more I got beyond the surface and I started really studying Roman generals and these people, the more I studied them, the more alien they began to look to me. And he began to recognize this is all my sensibilities, all of my instincts, my conscience. I can't, I mean, so think about Spartans chucking, babies that appear weak or enfeebled off of a cliff. All of this just, he began to recognize, I have to be honest. I find this truly appalling. This is not how I look at human beings. I care about the, quote, least of these. I care about people with disabilities. I care about, children. I care about those who are vulnerable in society and the marginalized. But why? By no means is it self-evident that these people ought to be protected. And in fact, in the past, in most cultures, they are not, and they suffer massively. Why do I see that? So, and then, I mean, again, that's what led him to the feet of Christ. And also the notion that the King, the Lord of all creation, would then, you know, conquer all through an instrument of complete humiliation and torture and defeat. That through that he would bring about a new moral order. All of that is just so we're over familiarity has killed it for us in some ways, and we're not appreciating how strange and how intimately we're all formed by that.
Well,
And
we'll
so
tell the story
just the tremendous wealth that we get from it.
Of Ali, of her son Ali's statement about like what was the story where somebody's asked, why do bad things happen, or why are people treat each other like this?
So she was at an open forum, and a lady asked, a very 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 nice lady. This lady's identified herself. She said, I've been a liberal my entire life, and I want to understand why what is happening in America right now. Why this social disintegration? You talked about your background, Miss Ali, when you were in Somalia and places like Mogadishu, where people were just killing each other, and there was just all sorts of social instability. Now we see it here. Why is it? Why do we have all this social instability? And she's got a very kind of, just Ali can get away with things that nobody else can. It's just, it's interesting. But she said, do you have siblings? And then the entire audience just laughed. But then she went on to say something very profound. She said, the question is not why are people killing each other or why is there conflict? The question is, when you go into a place where there isn't conflict, why is there peace right now? So when she came to the Netherlands, for instance, from Somalia, I think she was 19. She was gobsmacked by the fact that women and men could walk by each other on the street without the women being assaulted by the men. Now, sadly, she'll say now that's not the case anymore, because she's talking about an immigrant crisis that has made sexual assault huge in Europe, but and here too. That's another discussion. But she's talking about, she was just blown away by what we take for granted as just basic social order. You can walk into a store and food is available. It's there on the shelves. You can buy it. You can walk through a crowd, and all things being equal, you'll be just fine. Nobody's going to attack you. You're just living well with other people. We're taking that for granted. That doesn't happen on accident. That is here for a reason, and it's incredibly fragile. It's not something it's not guaranteed. And these people are recognizing that we are living on the borrowed credit from Christianity to give us the virtues necessary to sustain that kind of a social order. That's the vision that they have. So they envision a civilization that flourishes and is enlivened by Christian values and virtues. And because they know as well, Ayana Hirsi Ali knows what it looks like when you step out of that social order. Another one, there's Peter Hitchens, who's when he traveled we lived for 2 years in Soviet Russia as a foreign correspondent there. And he writes about this very hauntingly in his book, The Rage Against God. Just even something as simple as holding a door open for somebody there, people would look at you like you were insane. Like, what are you doing? People, basic decency and civility and courtesy were utterly absent, completely scrubbed from the Soviet, countries at that point. And so again, it's a picture of what, and he's another one who became a Christian. You could put him in this category as well, largely for what appear to be, some of the social, order benefits of the faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's the hang up though, Cameron, and this is why. So if we're using the phrase Christian nationalism, where you and I are making a positive case here for saying, look, these are elements that are stabilizing to our culture, and we've in this episode primarily relied on people who aren't Christians or are new to Christianity coming to the point of making that claim. Here's where it gets weird, is because, and this is a modern cultural thing. funny enough, this is a modern cultural thing, which is that we're living in a time in which nobody wants to say this culture is better than this culture. So any type of comparative
Right.
thing
Yep.
seems elitist and condescending and
Yep.
ethnocentric, or we have a cultural value of respecting other people's opinions that has been extended to the point that we now don't differentiate between the stable or pragmatic value of any of those differences. And so it's almost interesting that some of these voices are coming from a non-Christian space to say, actually, we can do a compare and contrast here. Um, and these are the
Yes.
different foundational ideas, and this is the way they manifest themselves in culture. And this isn't speculative. We now have 1,000 years of history we can point to and say that this set of fundamental presuppositions um, provides the lubricant for functioning modern cultures, unlike other systems of belief do. That's the hard thing for, I think, a lot of people who would say, well, yeah, clearly, this
Yep.
system lets women vote and this one doesn't let them drive. Or, there's
Mhm.
almost an obviousness. There's like an emperor wears no clothes kind of thing going on here, but we're just now at a turning point where I think people are starting to call a spade, perhaps. Um, and we also don't want to make it sound like it's a
Yep.
comparison between religions. It's not like, oh, this is Christianity versus Islam. That is one of the categories, but actually, Christianity versus naturalism is the scarier one. Um, as far as which one provides a better foundation for what it is, the truths that we apparently hold to be self-evident for the formation of, if you're listening to this as an American, that naturalistically certainly aren't. So uh, that's the tension, I think, is to say,
Yeah.
are
I
we
mean,
at a place where people are willing to
it
say,
is.
actually,
Yes.
this culture is better than this structuring of human community?
Yeah. It's deeply ingrained to not do that. But I mean, I would say you have to, if you make the distinction between, we're not saying you say a way of life is superior, you say a culture is superior. It's not the same thing as saying the persons in this culture are superior to these persons. So I think our political system in the United States is superior to that of China. I do
Mhm.
not want to live. I do not want America to look like modern China ever. The reason I'm bringing up modern China is because this is often, some people will use this as an example. China itself will say, look, we're an example of an authoritarian government. Some people might use a stronger word there, an authoritarian government, and we're prosperous as a nation. I don't know. Look at China. I mean, just even look at the way China responded as a nation to COVID-19. Do you want to live there? Is that the kind, are those kinds of draconian government policies something you want to live under? If you're
Oh,
answering no to any of these, which I'm assuming most of you are, then you clearly think there are superior modes of life.
you, you know,
There's a better way to live. There's a better way to run a government. Yeah.
you know where there's a funny micro version of this whole argument that shows up is when people have kids and then
What's
think,
up?
"Oh, I need to take my kid to church so they can go to Sunday school." Like, I'm not going to believe, but I think it's important for
Mm-hmm.
my kids to have some kind of moral foundation and moral value system. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Yep.
that's the little
You
micro
recognize it's
version.
good.
Yeah, I know this is good,
Yes.
but anyhow.
But so why are we thinking about this in these terms? Well, because we're at a moment of as Os Guinness says, we're at a civilizational moment. It's a moment of real crisis right now. And we don't know exactly how this all ends, but this is why we're in a position to appreciate what it is we have. We're in a position to appreciate what it is we're losing. We haven't lost it yet in America. And by it, what do I mean? The Christian heritage. I'm not arguing that America is a Christian nation. I'm arguing, along with Tom
Mhm.
Holland and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, that we have been shaped by Christian values, and to deny that is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, if you're living inside a house, it's hard to know what the outside of it looks like. And I think for the vast majority of Americans, we've had that experience of growing up within a system that we assume that the whole world looks like it, and that's not true. I wonder, as we're bringing this, I was watching a clip where somebody said to Jordan Peterson, look, maybe using language similar to what Cameron just did, is saying, this is a moment of, very much could be constructed as a moment of crisis. um, how are things going to go? How is it going to turn out? And Peterson said, I don't know. He said, it all depends on the degree to which we are willing to take up our cross and walk uphill. And I thought that was such an interesting, it summarizes, I think, this podcast very well, where here you have somebody who is not claiming to be a Christian, who can only respond to the big questions of our culture by using Christian imagery, and specifically Christ's example of sacrificial obedience and doing hard things. And so let's conclude this part one when we're looking at the value of the good that can come from the idea of thinking about nations that are constructed on foundational Christian ideas, with that quote. Let's also say there's a part two to this. So tune in next time to say, what are the real dangers and what are some of those negative connotations, and what are the things that, based off of the past, the church has to have our spidey senses and our antenna and red flags ready of saying, this is not a direction that we want to go when we're thinking about Christian nationalism. So part one, yeah, we can see real beauty to the things that Christ taught in the way that it reorganizes our relationships with other people because of our relationship with God. Part two is going to say, like all good things, humans are specialists at taking good ideas and weaponizing them and poking ourselves in the eye with them and injuring other people. So I hope this has been a helpful encouragement to you to be thankful for and appreciate the moral and theological heritage that has gone before you if you're living in a part of the world that does allow you to have certain freedoms like we do here in the States. But then let's prepare ourselves to look at some of the cautions and ways in which we don't want to become un-Christ-like in that pursuit. So you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.